They called her the tree woman before they called her anything kinder. I know because I was one of the ones who called her that, and I wasn't being kind when I said it. I was 26 that spring, still farming my father's ground because he'd gotten too stiff in the hips to climb down off the tractor without help, and I had the certainty of a young man who has never once been wrong in a way that cost him. Mrs. Adele Werner moved onto the old Kessler place in March, a widow from somewhere down south nobody could quite name. And by the second week of April she had 30 saplings staked out along the low end of her 40 acres in a pattern that made no sense to any of us. You have to understand what that ground was. The Kessler place had been let go for 6 years after old man Kessler died, and his children fought over it in a courthouse 2 counties away. Weeds took the fence lines. The barn roof caved on the north side. That low 40 was the worst of it. A stretch of bottom ground that flooded in a wet spring and cracked like old pottery in a dry August, and Kessler himself had never gotten a decent corn crop off it in 40 years of trying. When we heard a widow had bought it, we figured she'd been swindled. When we saw what she planted, we knew it. Trees. Rows of little whips no taller than my knee, and not fruit trees either, not the pecans or the peaches that at least a person could understand. Just skinny things with narrow leaves, spaced far apart, running along the contour of that useless bottom in curving lines that followed the land instead of fighting it. My father squinted at them from the road the first time we drove past. He didn't say tree woman. He said something worse in its own quiet way. He said, "That woman's planting shade for a field she'll never farm." And that became the story of her. Everybody agreed on it. She was a widow with a little money and a soft head, planting shade trees on cropland because she didn't know the difference, because she was lonely, because grief had turned her sideways. Half the county felt sorry for her and the other half laughed, and I confess I did some of both, which is the most cowardly combination there is. I want to tell you how wrong we were, but I have to tell it the way it happened, which means I have to tell you how long it took me to see it, because the seeing is the whole story. The trees were never the story. I was the story, and I didn't know it. The first time I actually spoke to her was in May, and it wasn't because I wanted to. My father sent me over with a length of chain. That's how neighbors were then, even neighbors you'd quietly decided were fools. She'd gotten her little pickup stuck in the soft ground down by her tree lines after a rain, and word had traveled the way it does, and my father said, "Go help the woman. She's on her own over there." So I went, dragging my feet the whole way in my mind if not my boots. She was standing at the edge of the mud when I pulled up, an older woman, maybe 65, in a man's work shirt with the sleeves rolled, and a straw hat gone soft at the brim. She wasn't wringing her hands or apologizing the way I expected. She was looking at her trees. "You're the Holly's boy," she said, not a question. "Yes, ma'am, my daddy sent the chain." "Your daddy's the one who told the Petersons I planted a shade grove." She said it without heat, almost amused, the way you'd note that the weather had turned. I felt my face go hot anyway. I hadn't known the words had traveled that far or landed that squarely. I didn't answer. I hooked the chain to her axle and pulled her truck out, and it came free with a long sucking sound, and I unhooked and coiled the chain and figured I was done. But she was still looking at the trees, and something in the way she stood there made me look too, really look, for the first time. They weren't planted in rows. I'd thought they were rows from the road. Up close I could see they curved, following some logic I couldn't read, wide gaps between the lines, and between them the ground wasn't bare dirt but planted in something low and green I didn't recognize. "What is that?" I said, "between the trees?" "Which time are you asking about?" she said. "This year or in 6 years?" I didn't understand the question, so I didn't answer it. I said the trees would take 20 years to make any shade worth having, and by then she'd have wasted 40 acres of ground that could have been in corn. I said it plainer than I should have to a woman I just met. That's the kind of thing you say at 26 when you've decided you already know. She looked at me for a while, not angry, measuring. "You farmed that bottom of your daddy's," she said, "the one by the creek." "All my life." "What'd it make last year?" I told her. It wasn't much. That bottom was the same kind of ground as hers, and it drowned or it burned, same as Kessler's, and everybody knew it, and I said as much like it was a law of nature nobody could argue with. "So you plant it every year," she said, "knowing what it'll do to you." "It's cropland, you plant cropland." She nodded slowly, like I'd confirmed something she'd suspected, and she thanked me for the chain, and I drove home feeling like I'd won an argument. It took me a long time to understand I'd lost one. I just hadn't heard the score yet. That summer was dry. Not a killing drought, not yet, but dry the way that makes a farmer stand at his window in the evening watching the sky do nothing. My father's bottom by the creek burned. The corn tasseled short and the ears came in nubby, and we ran the numbers in August and knew that 40 acres had cost us money to plant and would pay us back with insult. It was an old story. We told it every few years and it never got easier to hear. I drove past the Kessler place more than I needed to that summer. I told myself it was on the way to things, and sometimes it was, but the truth is I wanted to see her trees fail. I wanted the dry to prove me right, to burn up her foolish little grove and send her back south wherever she'd come from, because if she was a fool then I was wise, and a young man will drive a long way out of his path to feel wise. Her trees didn't burn. They didn't do much of anything that first summer, being just whip still, but they held their leaves when the wild trees along the road went crisp and gray. And the green between them, the low-planted stuff I hadn't recognized, that held too. I couldn't figure it. Same ground, same sky, same rain not falling. In September I stopped again, and I don't fully know why. I told myself I was returning the chain, though the chain had been returned in June. She was down among the trees with a hoe, and she straightened up when she heard my truck, and she didn't seem surprised to see me. I've thought since that she'd been expecting me for months, the way you expect a slow storm you've seen building on the horizon. "They didn't die," I said. I meant it to sound casual. It came out accusing. "No," she said. "They wouldn't. Come here, put your hand in the ground." I hesitated. A grown man doesn't kneel down and put his hand in a stranger's dirt on command. But there was something in her that expected to be obeyed, not out of pride but out of a kind of certainty, and I knelt and pushed my fingers into the soil between two of her little trees. It was cool. It was cool and it was damp, 3 inches down in September in a dry year, in bottom ground that on my father's place had cracked wide enough to swallow a fence post. I pulled my hand back like the dirt had spoken to me. "How?" I said. "The trees," she said, "and what's under them and what's between them, and time, mostly time." She wiped her hands on her trousers. "You want to understand it, you'll have to come back more than once because it isn't one thing. Your kind always wants it to be one thing, one trick. It's not a trick, it's a friendship. You don't understand a friendship in one afternoon. Your kind. That stung, and it was meant to, and it was fair. I drove home and didn't tell my father where I'd been. I want to be honest about what happened next, which is that nothing happened next for a while. I didn't become her student overnight. I didn't have some flash of light on the road. I was a proud young man with a father to care for and my own ground to farm, and it's an embarrassing thing to walk up to a woman you've mocked and ask her to teach you. So I did what proud people do. I stayed away, and I thought about it, and I asked around instead, which is the coward's way of learning. Nobody knew anything. The county had a story about her, and the story was fool, and a story like that closes people's eyes better than any blindfold. The Petersons said she'd overpaid for the land. The man at the feed store said she never bought seed corn, never bought fertilizer to speak of, hardly bought anything, which he offered as proof she wasn't a real farmer. It didn't occur to any of us that a person who doesn't need to buy fertilizer might not be failing at farming. Might be succeeding at something we didn't have a word for. My father got sicker that winter. His hips, and then his chest, and then a long gray stretch where he sat by the stove, and I ran the whole place alone and learned what my grandfather must have known, that a farm is a thing that eats a man slowly and calls it a living. I was tired in a way that leaves no room for curiosity. I forgot about the tree woman for whole weeks at a time. But in the spring, when I was planting the crop, I found myself standing at the edge of that bottom by the creek. Our bottom, the one that burned or drowned. I stood there with a bag of seed corn in the truck behind me, and I could not make myself plant it. I'd planted it every spring of my life. My father before me, his father before him. And standing there that morning, I heard her voice in my head, plain as if she were beside me. So you plant it every year, knowing what it'll do to you. And for the first time in my life, I asked myself why, and I did not have an answer, only a habit wearing the costume of an answer. I left the seed corn in the truck. I drove to the Kessler place. She was on her porch with coffee, and when I got out she poured a second cup without asking and set it on the rail, and I understood that this was the answer to a question I hadn't managed to ask out loud. I climbed the steps and took the coffee, and we sat, and for a long time neither of us said anything. That was the first thing she taught me, though I didn't recognize it as teaching. She taught me that you could sit with a question and not rush it. That silence wasn't empty. My whole life had been noise and hurry, tractors and deadlines and my father's cough, and here was a woman who could sit on a porch and let the morning arrive on its own schedule. My husband and I had ground like your bottom, she finally said. Down in the Flatwoods country, worst 40 on the place. We fought it 30 years. Then he got sick, and while he was dying he said the strangest thing to me. He said, Adele, we've been at war with that field our whole lives, and I never once asked it what it wanted to grow. She sipped her coffee. I didn't know what he meant. I thought it was the medicine talking. But after he passed, I couldn't farm the big place alone, so I sold it, and I had this one thought I couldn't shake, and it was his thought, not mine. What does the field want to grow? So I sold out and I took the money, and I came up here looking for the worst ground I could afford, so I could ask it that question with nobody watching me do it. That's why you bought Kessler's bottom, I said, on purpose, because it was bad. Because it was bad, she said. Because bad ground tells the truth. Good ground will forgive you for being a fool. Bad ground won't. You want to learn the truth about how land works. You go to the ground that's been suffering because it's got the most to say. I sat with that. It rearranged something in me. My whole life the goal had been to find the good ground, the flat black bottom that made 200 bushels, and to curse the bad ground as bad luck. It had never once occurred to me that the bad ground was the honest one. Teach me, I said. It cost me everything I had to say it. The trees, what's under them, all of it. I'll work for it. I'll do whatever you need doing over here. Just teach me. She looked at me a long time, the way she had that first day by the mud, measuring. It'll take years, she said. Not a season, years. Are you the kind that can want a thing for years? I don't know, I said. It was the truest thing I'd said to anyone in a long while. But I want to find out. That answer satisfied her more than a confident one would have. She nodded and set down her cup, and we walked out to the trees, and my real education began at the age of 28, which is late, but not too late, which is the mercy of it. I won't pretend I can give you in a few minutes what took me years to gather, but I can tell you the shape of it, because the shape is what mattered. The trees weren't for shade. That was the whole joke of it, the joke the county told about her, and the deeper joke the county never got to hear. The trees were the beginning of a machine, if you can call a living thing a machine, a slow green machine for fixing a broken field, and every part of it did more than one job. The narrow-leaved trees she'd planted were a kind that pulls nitrogen out of the very air and feeds it down into the soil through its roots, so that the ground grew richer under them every year without a single bag of fertilizer bought at any store. That was the first thing that made the feed store man wrong about her. She didn't buy fertilizer because her trees were making it, quietly, out of nothing but air and time. the way they had been doing for 1,000 years in places no man ever plowed. The curving lines they were planted in followed the exact contour of the land, so that when the rain came hard the water didn't run off in a sheet, carrying the topsoil to the creek the way it did on our place. It slowed. It pooled in the shallow swales she'd shaped between the tree lines, and it sank in down deep into the ground, and that was why her dirt was cool and damp in September when mine was cracked open. She wasn't catching more rain than I was. She was keeping it. All my life I'd let my water run away, and then cursed the sky for not sending more. The low green plants between the trees, the ones I hadn't recognized, were a cover, a living blanket over the soil that kept it from baking, that fed the small hidden lives in the dirt, the worms and the roots and the 10,000 things too small to see that a farmer never thinks about and cannot farm without. She never let the ground go bare. Bare ground, she told me, is a wound. Every year of my life I had left my fields bare all winter and called it clean. And there was more than I can lay out here, layers of it. The way she'd planted early things and late things together so the ground was never resting when it could be working. The way she read the weeds not as enemies but as messages, each weed telling her what the soil was missing or holding. I learned to read them too, eventually. There's a certain weed that only grows where the ground is packed too hard, and when I finally learned to see it, I understood that my father's bottom had been shouting at us for 40 years, and we'd been mowing down its voice and calling it maintenance. But I've gotten ahead of myself, and that's the young man's disease even in an old man's telling. Because the real turn of this story, the harvest that changed everything, didn't come from any of what I've just told you. It came from a single afternoon 3 years in, and I have to tell you about the drought first, because without the drought you won't understand. The 4th summer I knew her, the rain stopped in June and didn't come back. It was the drought they still name around here, the one the old-timers measure other dry years against. The creek that fed our bottom went to a string of stagnant pools, and then to cracked mud. The county dried up and blew away in a brown haze, and men who'd farmed all their lives stood at their fences and watched their corn die standing up, the leaves rolling into gray tubes, the whole field rattling in the hot wind like a thing already dead and just waiting to be told. My father's bottom died first, as it always did. But that year the good ground died too, the flat black ground that had never failed anybody, because there is a dry that even good ground can't survive when it's been left bare and beaten, and asked to hold no water of its own. That was the year the county learned that all its good ground had been living on borrowed rain, and when the rain stopped, the loan came due. I remember driving to Adele's that August in a kind of despair. My father was failing. Our crop was gone, and I confess a shameful part of me expected her grove to be dead too, because if the good ground couldn't make it, how could the worst 40 in the county? And there was an old, ugly voice in me that would almost have been comforted to find her failed alongside the rest of us. Misery is a companionable thing. I came over the rise and I stopped the truck in the road and I sat there, and I could not make sense of what I was seeing. Her 40 was green. Not lush. Nothing was lush that year, but green, living green in a brown dead county, the trees holding their narrow leaves in the ground between them covered and alive, and down in the low swales where the water had pooled and sunk for 4 years there was moisture still held in the deep ground, enough, just enough. And the crops she grew between her trees that year, the beans and the squash and the grain that grew in the shelter and the shade and the kept water of that slow green machine, those crops made a harvest. In the worst year anyone could remember, on the worst ground anyone could name, the tree woman made a harvest, and half the county made nothing at all. I sat in that truck and I wept. I'm not ashamed to say it now, though I was then. I wept because I understood, finally and completely all at once, the size of what I'd been too proud to see. She hadn't planted trees for shade. She'd planted a field that could survive the day the sky stopped giving, and she'd done it on the ground we'd all sworn was worthless, and she'd done it while we laughed, and she'd never once laughed back. I want to tell you the county came to its senses that year. The truth is slower and more human than that. Some men came around. A few of the younger ones, the ones who'd lost the least pride because they had the least invested, drove out to look at her green 40 and ask their questions. But most of the older men found reasons. They said she'd gotten lucky with a spring, a low spot, a fluke of the land. It's a terrible thing to watch a man choose the story that lets him stay wrong, but I'd been that man, so I couldn't judge too hard. It took me 4 years and a flood of tears to give up my version. Why should it take them any less? My father was one who couldn't give it up. He was too far gone by then, in his body, and in the old certainties that had held him up his whole life, and when I tried to tell him what I'd learned, he looked at me like I'd joined a church he didn't believe in. That was a grief inside the larger grief. I had found the thing that could have saved our bottom, and I'd found it too late to share it with the man who'd handed me that bottom, because his mind had already closed its gate for the season and wouldn't open again. He died that winter. I planted his bottom the next spring, but I planted it Adele's way, the contour lines and the trees and the cover and the patience, and it took years, everything with her took years, but that ground came back. The ground my family had cursed for 3 generations came back, and it's green now, and it holds its water, and my own boy farms it, and he thinks it was always this way. I let him think it. Some inheritances are better received without the weight of their history. Adele taught me until she couldn't anymore. She got old in front of me the way the people you love do, all at once after years of nothing, and near the end she couldn't get down among her trees. So I'd carry her out in a lawn chair and set her at the edge of the grove, and she'd look at it and not say much. She'd earned her silences by then, all of them. The last real conversation we had, she said a thing I've carried ever since. "You know what they got wrong," she said. "It wasn't the trees. Anybody can plant a tree. What they got wrong was time. They thought a field was a thing you took from every year. I planted a field you give to first, and it gives back later more than you gave for longer than you'll live." She was quiet a while. "Your kind wants the harvest in the fall. My kind plants for a harvest we won't see. That's the only real difference between a farmer and a fool, and from the outside in the early years you cannot tell them apart. That's why they laughed. They caught me in the years when the two looked the same." She died in the spring, which was right, and I buried her at the high end of her 40 where she could look down the contour lines at the whole slow green machine she'd built out of ruined ground and one dying man's question. Her stone doesn't say tree woman. I made sure of that. But sometimes, when a young farmer stops on the road and asks me what all these trees are for, I have to fight the urge to tell him the old story, the fool's story, just to watch his face when the drought comes and the trees hold and he understands, too late and just in time, the way I did. I don't tell it that way anymore, though. I've gotten too old to enjoy watching a young man be wrong the way I was wrong. Instead, I do what she did for me. I pour a second cup of coffee and set it on the rail, and I say, "Come here, put your hand in the ground." 3 inches down, even in a dry September, even now it's cool. It's cool and it's damp and it's alive, and it will outlast me the way it outlasted her, and that's the harvest that changed everything. Not the beans, not the squash, not even the drought year that proved her right in front of the whole laughing county. The harvest that changed everything was me. She grew me the same way she grew that field, slow and on purpose, out of poor material everybody else had given up on, giving first and waiting years for the return. And I didn't see it happening any more than the field did. You never do when you're the thing being grown. They thought she was planting trees for shade. She was planting all of it for people she'd never meet, on land she'd never see finished. And I am one of the crops she brought in, and I have spent the rest of my life trying to be worth the patience it took to raise me.